Bonjour and welcome to French Footprints, the podcast sharing steps you can take towards raising bilingual children. I'm your host, Amy Mann, founder of Un de Trois Petits Pas, where I teach parents and children how to introduce French at home in fun, engaging, and accessible ways. Through Canadian Parents for French and funding from the Government of Canada, the French Footprints program shares research-based techniques and expertise to help build the confidence of parents and better the future of their kids. Today, we are tackling a question I hear a lot from parents. Is introducing French as a second language right for my child with special learning needs? It's common for families to be told that learning two languages might be too hard or confusing for a child with developmental challenges, but what if that's not actually true? To help us understand what the research really says, I'm so grateful to be joined by Dr. Fred Genesee, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at McGill University. Dr. Genesee is one of the leading researchers in bilingualism and language acquisition in children, including those with special needs. His work has helped shift the conversation around what's truly possible for all learners when it comes to bilingual education. So, Dr. Genesee, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, I'm going to start with a big question. Why do you think the myth still exists that children with special needs shouldn't learn a second language? Where does that idea come from?
Well, I suspect that the main reason why people continue to think that, despite the research, is from their own experiences. We all know one language, at least, and we know children learn one language without much difficulty for the most part, and they become functionally competent in one language. We also know people who have attempted to learn a second language and often struggle with that, and in many cases fail to reach full functional competence. And we extrapolate from that. Maybe it is difficult to learn a second language, no matter how young you are and no matter what your circumstances are. And I think these experiences are not a good basis for conjecturing about children, because these impressions about second language learning are based on adults who attempt to learn a second language in early adulthood or later adulthood. And the circumstances for learning a language at that time is not optimal. So this, I think, leads to the further assumption that the brain is probably well suited to learn one language completely and competently, but it is a challenge for people to learn a second language or a third language because the brain is not designed for that purpose. And in effect, I think a lot of people believe that the brain is monolingual and so only learns one language easily.
So we think that potentially these concerns are coming from a misunderstanding of the brain. Is that basically what we're saying here?
I think so. I think that is the underlying reason. I don't think people think of it necessarily directly in terms of the brain, but they look around them and they see people who have tried to learn a second language, maybe in school, but maybe outside school, and they struggled and not been very successful. But it's important when you look at the success rates in second language learning that you look at the circumstances under which children are acquiring an additional language.
Okay, well, that actually leads me into the next question, which is what are the specific concerns that parents have in general regarding bilingualism?
Well, I think there are 3 or 4 main concerns. One is that if indeed the brain is monolingual, as I say, and adding a second language to the native language or first language of the child is going to be an additional burden. So it will slow the child down, and they'll be delayed in their acquisition of the native language if they're being exposed to 2 languages at birth. It may also interfere with their acquisition of the native language if they're acquiring a second language later on. And I think another very common concern among parents, I have comments and questions about this all the time from parents, is that they think that raising children bilingually and even educating them bilingually will cause confusion. In the case of preschool children, they think the confusion will arise from the difficulty children would have in distinguishing between one language and another. So parents who live in a French-English family think that children might have trouble knowing which language is being used. And in effect, what they do is they mix the two languages up. And when they speak, they're going to actually mix them. And they take code mixing, which is a common phenomenon among bilingual children and adults. They assume that that mixing is actually a sign of underlying confusion, when in fact it's actually just a communication strategy that many bilinguals use, adults and children. I think a third concern that parents often have, which is related to these two other concerns, is that children who are learning a second language, either simultaneously with the first language or after they've learned the first language, that they will have incomplete acquisition of one or both languages. So there's this sort of simplistic notion about the brain, I think, that the brain is only really capable of learning one language completely, and adding additional languages to that is a burden, and it will slow children down. And in the extreme, people think that it may result in language impairment.
Okay, so these are their concerns, but could you walk us through what the research actually shows about children with special needs, and what does the evidence say about children with special needs learning more than one language?
Well, there's really two bodies of research that are relevant to this question. One body of research has focused on children who grow up learning two languages in the preschool years. And another body of research is focused on children who come to school monolingual, but they're being educated in a second language or two languages, like immersion programs in Canada. And it's very important to distinguish between these two bodies of research because they're telling us different things, very important things. So I'm going to start with research on preschool children who are exposed to two languages in the preschool years, and they're exposed to those languages in non-school contexts. So this research is very, very important because the preschool years provides us evidence about children's capacity for language learning. As I said in the beginning, all children learn at least one language, for the most part, without much difficulty. So if we can understand how these children acquire two languages, we can really uncover issues about their capacity for language learning. Now, research around the world, which has started to look at bilingual children in the preschool years, shows that under the right conditions, children have no difficulty learning two languages at the same time. They don't show confusion. They don't show delay much, but if they do, the delay is very short-lived. And they can acquire complete functional competence in two languages. The take-home message from this is that children, when they're born, have the capacity for learning two languages. And most researchers, I think, a lot, would argue that learning two languages for most children is just as easy as learning one if it occurs during the preschool years in a family context. Now, the parallel to that research, which has been done with typically developed children, there's more and more research on children who are growing up in families where the child might have a language learning difficulty or a developmental difficulty. And that research, much to our surprise, frankly, I think most people, is that these children, if you look at children with developmental disorders or special needs, if you want, who are being exposed to two languages in the family from birth, and you compare them to some of the children who are acquiring only one language at the same time, the children who are exposed to two languages don't show any more serious problems than the children who are growing up with one language, despite the fact that they have a developmental disorder. So the developmental disorder it's remarkable that it doesn't actually make language learning more difficult, which was the common conception that if these children have difficulty learning language for whatever reason, then learning two languages surely would be harder than learning one. And yet, despite the fact that we've been looking for these difficulties, we haven't found them. So this has been rather surprising, I think, even to researchers. And I think it speaks to not only the capacity of the brain, but it also speaks to the motivation of children, infants, to learn language. It's such a strong impulse that it's almost impossible to stop it from happening, even if the children have developmental disorders of various sorts. Now, if you look at children in the school years, I talked about preschool children. If you look at children in the school years and they come to school, let's say, speaking English, but they're in a French immersion program. The research that has looked at these children, and these would be typically developing children, you find that they advance through school at the same rate and at the same level as children who are being educated in one language only. So once again, we're seeing evidence that exposure to two language does not cause extra burdens to these children. And of particular relevance, it doesn't prevent them from learning academic material, science, mathematics, through the medium of the second language. Now, it's important to consider for purposes of this podcast, what about children with special needs who might be in a French immersion program? Because there's often hesitancy by not only parents, but also educators to enroll children in French immersion programs, again, under the assumption that if these children are bound to have problems because of their developmental difficulties, they're going to have even more difficulty if they're being educated through a language that they don't already know. Now, there's not as much research on these children as we would like, because it's very hard to do this research. What happens often when these children are identified as having a special need, they're often pulled out of the immersion program. So it's hard to get a sample of children who do this. But we've recently been doing some research in the Ottawa area. And the Ottawa School Board is very interesting because it encourages children with special needs to go into French immersion in the kindergarten and in the pre-grade 1 level. And their thinking is that it's important for parents to have the experience for their children gaining immersion and then make the decision about gaining immersion rather than presupposing that they know what's going to happen. What we find is that the children in these French immersion programs who have been identified as having a special need of various sorts, when you look at their results in grade 3, they're scoring at the same level on provincial achievement tests as similar children with similar special needs in an English-only program. And in many cases, actually, they're scoring better in immersion than students in an English-only program. Now, there's other evidence that supports this, but overall, again, despite the fact that we've been trying to see if there are difficulties, we haven't found them in the research. Now, it's always important when researchers like me talk about research on children, especially children with special needs, that you appreciate that this is research that's reporting the results on groups of children. And you always, if you're making decisions about a child, you have to consider individual differences. And the research seldom looks at individual differences in these programs. So what I'm saying is true on average for kids with special needs. There are bound to be individual children for whom growing up bilingually or being educated bilingually is not going to work as well as it will for some other children with special needs. And we always have to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting because a lot of what you're saying, it shows us that a lot of our concerns are coming from us trying to understand language learning as adults and how it's something we see as being difficult. So we're trying to use our adult logic, and really we need to be focused on the children, right? So it's really incredible to know, first of all, that it's possible for them. But let me ask you this question. Can bilingualism actually be beneficial for these children?
Well, definitely. And I think that the most important benefit of knowing another language, in addition to one's home language, is that it provides you skill to communicate with other languages so that you can interact with people who speak the other language. You can travel to those places where that language is spoken and feel perfectly comfortable and benefit from being there. You can also seek out information in those languages, either on the internet or in books and so on. So it really, the primary benefit, I think, of an immersion program, for example, or being bilingual under these circumstances, is the social communicative aspect. It's really a really important advantage. There's also the advantage in a somewhat related thing that in this sort of increasing globalized world and international world, that being able to communicate in another language can often be a skill that is useful when children leave school and they're looking for a job. employers are often looking for skilled in certain areas. And if they know another language, that's often an additional benefit if you're bilingual, so that you can actually be eligible for and considered for jobs where bilingualism is a real advantage. And there's some research that's been done out of California that has shown that especially bilinguals who are literate, they can read and write the other language, enjoy economic advantages in their jobs compared to monolinguals because they're at a premium. I think in the case of children with special needs, that being in an immersion program has also the advantage that, in effect, when you're in an immersion program, students get a lot of attention. Jose Pedagogic said to me once that all children in an immersion program have a learning difficulty or special needs. Most of them do not speak the other language. So teachers often will adopt instructional strategies, and the curriculum will be adapted to take into account that these children are also learning a language as well as math and science. So this additional attention, individualized attention that children get in an immersion program, I think is a particular advantage for students with special needs.
That is such an interesting point, and you're absolutely right. As a second language teacher myself, I know that there's certain things that we do to make sure we're really supporting all children because they are doing something that is a little bit more tricky, right? And so that makes absolute sense that there is that added attention. I really like that perspective.
I remember an immersion teacher telling me once that when a student seemed to be struggling with something, she assumes that she's not doing the right thing, that she needs to back up and reconsider how she's teaching whatever she's teaching so that the students get it. Teachers who are teaching students who speak the language instruction when they come to school, there can be a tendency for teachers to think, well, if the students aren't getting it, it's because they're not working hard enough. So I think again, there's this advantage, and it's an advantage which is a particular utility for kids with special needs in the early grades.
That makes complete sense to me. I've come across several parents who have heard that they should stick to one language due to their child's special learning needs of some kind. But since we've just discussed how research might lead us otherwise, my next question for you is, what factors should parents consider when trying to decide whether or not to introduce French as a second language to their child at home or in school?
Well, let's consider the one parent language rule because it is interesting. This is a widely held view, and for families that are bilingual, the mother might speak one language and the father the other, or parents speak one language and parents speak the other. And the research shows that that it's not absolutely necessary for parents to do that. The children will pick up the languages no matter how they're used in the home. But I think that the one parent, one language strategy is not a bad idea for a couple of reasons. There are slight advantages to that, partly because you can be sure that the student is getting consistent exposure in each language. And this is particularly important for the language which was not favored in the community at large. So if you're in a Montreal situation and there's an English-French family, it's often advantageous, and they're living in a neighborhood that's largely English-speaking. It can be very advantageous if the French-speaking parent always uses French with the child, because then they can be sure that the child is getting consistent exposure to French in the home. Children in these kinds of environments tend to drift towards the language which is spoken by their peers in the community in the playground. And if they're in an English-speaking community, they're going to drift towards English because that's what all the French speaks. And so if the parents are insistent on using, one parent is insistent on using French, then you kind of can ensure that the child will get lots of good exposure in that language.
It's funny to hear you say that because it's exactly what I do at home. I actually speak French only with my sons, and then my husband speaks English with them. And we're in Ottawa, which is bilingual, but English is more prominent. And so I knew that if I wanted them to be, fluently bilingual from the beginning, it was really on me as the French speaker, the one that's the minority language, to really keep it up. And so it's cool to hear you talk about my exact situation.
Now, this is particularly important for children with special needs and who might have developmental issues in the preschool years, because there's quite a bit of research that shows that even in monolingual children, the amount of exposure they get to language has a big impact on their language development. So making sure that children get lots of good exposure to either one language or both languages is very, very important for all bilingual children, but especially for children with special needs. So that is one of the important conditions that parents should think of is consistency. Can they develop a strategy where they want to use the other language in the home? Can they stick with that? Can they make it happen all the time? Because it's the interesting thing about this research, after years of doing this, it's not a problem for children to learn two languages. The challenge is for the parents to make sure that their children are getting the exposure they need to learn both languages. Language learning is easy for children, but it doesn't happen automatically. And below some level of exposure, children will probably not master the language. So parents need to be consistent, as consistent as they can in their use of the language. They need to be ensure that the language is used over a period of time. They need to persevere, even though their child might be drifting towards one language or the other. They should persist, if they can, in using the non-dominant language so children get exposure to it. And I think if parents embark on a bilingual route for raising their children, they should stick at it. It's not something that you should take on lightly and then decide after a while, oh, this is too hard for me or my child, I'm going to drop it. I've heard of cases where parents, they started and then they drop it and they think, oh, that was a mistake, they should go back to it. You want to avoid that kind of on again, off again. Decide what you're going to do and stick to it, and make sure children get lots of exposure to enriched forms of the language. If you can, have them join play groups that are in the other language, watch TV in the other language, get read to in the other language. So you want to enrich their language experience as much as possible. That's true, again, for children with special needs. There's a tendency, I think, for children with special needs to limit what you teach them or what you do with them on the assumption that they can't handle it. But that's not a good strategy. They need even more enriched exposure than typically relevant children, because the more input they get, the better their language competence is in the long run.
No, that is absolutely true. And you're right. We shouldn't be limiting children based on our beliefs that they need to be limited, right? We need to be giving them more supports. I absolutely agree with that. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Fred. Your work continues to make such a difference in how families approach bilingualism with confidence. Before we go, though, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'd have to say that after spending many, many years studying children learning other languages, either in the preschool years or the school years, I've come to the conclusion, based on not only my own research, but research by people across Canada and around the world, that it's pretty clear children can be bilingual as easily as they can be monolingual if the learning conditions are right. The motivation to communicate with people around you in one or two languages is extremely strong, and children can meet that challenge without really too much difficulty. What is important, how successful children are in that, really depends upon the parents and the educators, and whether they can create the learning environments that give children the material they need in order to learn two languages. So I definitely think that children can be bilingual and can do it. The question is, can we adults do it for them, help them do it?
Absolutely. We need to give them the resources, the support. I completely agree. Thank you so much, Dr. Genesee, for spending time with us here on French Footprints.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure to share this information. It's important that it be shared with parents because it can be important and helpful when they're making their decisions.
So, to all of the parents listening, if you've been feeling unsure, worried about choosing French for your child with special needs, I hope that today's episode brought you a little peace of mind and a lot of encouragement. French is for everyone, and with the right support, your child can absolutely thrive in a bilingual learning journey. So, thank you so much again for spending time with us on French Footprints, Dr. Genesee, and to all of those listening. No matter your experience level, introducing French at home can be simple, fun, and effective. Keep listening as we continue to take steps towards a bilingual future. Au revoir!
This project has been made possible by the Government of Canada. Ce projet a été rendu possible grâce au gouvernement du Canada.